I'm going to do what's called a close reading of chapter 1. Originally, I was going to do chapter 1 and chapter 2 together because that is the way it's assigned in the course. You read chapters 1 and 2 as part of week 2. However, chapter 1 is really long, and I really wanted to show you kind of an in-depth analytical reading. I would like to preface this by saying I understand that I have an unfair advantage when it comes to this kind of close analytical active reading, primarily because my degrees are in English literature. I've done this a lot. I've had a lot of instruction in how to do it. I have a broad and deep understanding of literary devices. I also have a deep love for language and how language is used to construct meaning. That's just always something that has been my passion. Studied even when I was young. I've always been a reader. I read constantly and continuously. I have since I was young. Um, so I understand that that's a little bit biased in my favor. I know what I'm doing, which is helpful to you as students because obviously you can trust that I know what I'm doing. Now, this video is really just to mirror kind of a close reading. Also, one more point about how I have kind of an unfair advantage over you. I know the whole novel at this point. I've been through the novel multiple times. I have an understanding of it, a holistic understanding of it that allows me probably to see things in chapter 1 that you don't. So again, I'm going to tie it all together. This kind of analysis is just meant to help you understand the novel, give you some context. I am not going to explain how to take all of this and turn it into a paper. That's going to be your task, though I will give you some information about for example, the critical analysis, number 1 and number 2 papers. I am going to set up, or do have at this point probably, some videos to help you with that particular assignment. But I want to teach you how to read literature from an analytical perspective. Now, buckle in. It's going to take a little bit of time because I'm going to go through the novel very kind of with a fine-tooth comb. So if you need to take a break, that's okay. But I also would suggest taking notes because there's going to be a lot of information, and I'm going to go chronologically through the novel. I'm going to give you page references in the novel to keep you going along with me. So if you want to have your books out. Now I'm going to be using the Kindle version of Night. It does not have the same page references. So listen closely to the page references as we go, because that's going to be important for you. So what I'm going to start with obviously is just the very beginning. In the beginning, this first chapter starts out with Moishe, and he is a representative character, and we're going to talk about him. Then it moves, and we have the establishment of Elie's faith, which is really important. This chapter really sets up a lot of the themes, but isn't really as explicit about it as it comes later. I've said before that this is a novel of progression, because it reminds me of the analogy of, a frog in water. You just continually turn up the temperature gradually over time, and that frog is not going to jump out. It's eventually just going to be, I guess, cooked, or, that's a horrible image. I'm sorry about that, but that's what it reminds me of, just kind of this progression that just keeps happening gradually over time. Of course, probably until they get to the camps where it's just suddenly pretty significantly horror. So in the very beginning of this chapter, does start out with Moishe, but you get a lot of Jewish terms. Now, I also have an unfair advantage here too, because I did my master's thesis on a Jewish novel called The Messiah of Stockholm, and as part of that thesis, I did an entire chapter on the Jewish faith. So I had to know pretty much everything about the Jewish faith, even though I was reading The Messiah of Stockholm by Cynthia Ozick from a Christian perspective. Basically, the premise of my thesis was, can a Christian reader read a specifically Jewish story, a Jewish text that very heavily involved the Jewish faith to inform the meaning and all the themes, can a Christian reader who might not know as much about Judaism still take something away from that piece of literature? Are there going to be universal themes that speak to a Christian readership? So that was actually what my thesis was about, just FYI. Not that you probably cared, but there it is anyway. So I had to learn a lot about the Jewish faith. Now, when I first read this novel, if you could see some of my, and I may post this, I may take some pictures to show you how I annotate when I read. Everyone does it differently. At the very top of the page, you see all that white space. I have Talmud, Torah, Kabbalah, all written out, and I have definitions of them because that was just something that I needed for context. Now, is it important for the rest of the novel? No, but it does give me a sense of an understanding of the depth of Elie's faith, because even at 13, he's chasing the higher level, the higher order of Jewish study, even at 13. So that's, to me, why all of this stuff about these really particular points of Jewish faith are in there, because Wiesel is establishing his the depth and of his faith and the importance of it. So all of that is in there. So you don't really actually have to know all that, but it's really just an establishing, for me, the beginning of his faith. We have to understand how important his faith was, how deep it was, because the loss of faith, because that begins to inform the loss of faith seem that we see a progression of as we go through. Everyone clings to it, clings to it, clings to it. Other older Jewish elders, I guess, that are in the camps, they cling to it a lot longer than Elie does. And the depth of his faith, when he finally loses it, I think that's what makes it so significant and so profound to a reader, because it was so incredibly part of just who he is. And I'm going to show you a section here in a moment that goes through that. I don't know why that is pushing past. Hang on. So this book, I don't know what it is about this book, but the way that it's set up, it just really doesn't follow very easily. So here, this is the beginning then. So there's a section here I'm going to go through that basically shows, I'm looking for it, hang on, because now that I'm talking about it, I want to come through here. Moshe asks him, "Why do you pray?" And Elie says, "Why do I pray? Strange question. Why did I live?" So he's equating his faith to just who he is. Why did I breathe? It's just something that is a part of him that's as natural as breathing. And he said, "I don't know." I told him, even more troubled and ill at the ease, "I don't know." So what it actually comes down to is Elie has never had to question his faith, which again sets up that theme of loss of faith. So these are the kinds of things you can look for. Now, understanding at this point in the story, you don't understand that it's going to be a loss of faith, but you know that faith is important. The book starts out there, very, intensely showing Elie's faith. So you know that that's going to be a big part of what's coming. But you can read that and know that his faith is something that is just so much a part of him that it's like breathing. So that is something you know. Let me backtrack now and talk about Moshe. Moshe has a very specific role in the book. Whenever I think about characters, I think about, is the character representational, or are they central to the story? Obviously, Moshe comes just at the beginning, which makes him a representational character. He actually fulfills the role of something called a town crier. In literature, that basically means that he can be like the warning. He comes in and he communicates really vital information, and it's a narrative device where he's the messenger, or I guess in the colloquial terms of today, he's the mass media. Okay, and he comes in and it's part of the play. He gives elements of the plot that are coming up, and he gives social commentary. So his function in this particular chapter is he basically literally outlines the entire Holocaust. They're forced from their homes. They're literally murdered. I mean, that's what's coming. And so this is met with absolute skepticism, obviously, from the Jews. No one believes him. The important part to remember about that is, and again, you probably don't know this in chapter 1, you don't know it's going to be a theme, but you understand that there's a level of indifference, a willful disregard of a bona fide warning. Now, Moshe's character is that people largely don't pay attention to him, but we know he's important. We know that Elie respects him, so we know that he is someone to be believed. But the Jews completely ignore him, right? So it's really important. It establishes this pattern. And when I read literature, I look for patterns, and I look for connections. And Moshe is already demonstrating the importance of faith, and is also illustrating as the vehicle to show the indifference that people show to others in, abject, horrible situations. And the really kind of like the irony of it here is that it's the Jews who are doing it in the beginning. But the truth is they are illustrating that theme of indifference through their level of denial. There is actually a very specific progression of the Jews' attitude and reaction. So it goes from dismissal or skepticism, but outright dismissal, to doubt, to alarm, back again to denial, and then into disbelief until finally and acceptance. So as we move through, I'm moving on to that. Why do you pray is actually on page, in your book, it's on page 4. And we get a look also here at Elie's father. And again, this in the beginning, this is still just that establishment of faith. He is absolutely the Jewish authority. So we knew that Elie grew up with this strong, very devout faith. So, and Elie's father represents that kind of as a symbol through characterization, as a symbol of the faith that basically is what the Jews react to. They react according to, their faith and what their faith teaches them. So again, just more about the faith here in this first. Elie's father just helps establish the importance of faith. There's also a literary device here before we move on associated with Moshe. All of Elie's interactions with Moshe set up this concept of asking questions. Now, whenever we have a faith, a lot of people don't ask questions about the why of it. Why is this, what we follow? Why is this what we believe? And so Moshe comes in and starts talking to him, asks him questions, these rhetorical questions that really get him to think. And he says, for example, he explained to me with great emphasis that every question possessed a power that was lost in the answer. Man comes closer to God through the questions he asks him, he liked to say. And then says the real answers, Eliezer, you will find only within yourself. So first of all, this sets up Wiesel's use of rhetorical questions, which comes at the end, because questioning faith is what leads to Elie's loss of faith. So we see this use of questions, and I'm just going to tell you now, in Wiesel's book, every little thing is important. Every little thing is important because he's going to use it again later. He's just that incredible of a writer. So this idea of questioning faith and just using rhetorical questions, not just to get the characters to think or Elie to think, but the reader too. And so, like I said, again, the questioning faith comes with the loss of faith. Hey, I'm just going to jump over really quick and make sure this is recording, because I'm telling you what, I have lost this video so many times that I'm a little hesitant. Okay, so moving on. So that's all about the faith, and then moving on, this is what happens. So the Jews are expelled. And what is the reaction? Dismissal. So this is an allusion to, or a foreshadowing of how the world views what happens. And here's what it comes down to. What does indifference mean? Well, largely it means it doesn't matter if it's not happening to me. And this is what the Jewish people illustrate here. The dismissal, what do you expect? That's war. The deportees were quickly forgotten. If it's not right in front of my face, I don't think about it. If it's not happening to me, not important. That is the cornerstone of indifference. It's not even a matter of getting involved anymore. It's just absolute outright out of sight, out of mind. So Wiesel setting up this theme of indifference too, which we know from reading the preface and the foreword, is one of the main reasons why Wiesel writes this book. He said people are indifferent to what happened. If people continue to remain indifferent, things like this are going to continue to happen. So we know that it's really important, because even when Moshe comes back, on page 7, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it in here. He said, but I did not even believe him. So as it progresses, there are a couple of progressions in the first chapter that are important, but basically the two are the reactions of the Jewish people to what's happening, and then there is what is actually happening to them. So I already kind of told you what the Jewish reaction is: dismissal, doubt, alarm, denial, disbelief, acceptance. And that is based on plot. So if you were going to talk about plot as a literary theme or a part of literature, you could write something like the plot drives the Jewish reaction, and the Jewish reaction mirrors the world's reaction. So that's a larger kind of universal holistic approach. You could write a whole paper on that. So that would be something that if I were going to write a critical paper just on chapter 1, which you can do, you can write a whole literary analysis to every single chapter in this book. There are no fillers, no filler chapters, no throwaways. That might be something that I would explore and talk about. So sorry, I had a separate thought. My brain sometimes veers off. So Moshe comes back. He's begging people to listen to him. Nobody's listening. And then all of a sudden, there could no longer be any doubt. German would be defeated. Absolute denial. So this is where we start out. We doubted his resolve to exterminate us. Let me give you a page reference. This is on page 8. Chapter 1 goes from the first page of the novel to chapter 22. The first page is page 3, and your book goes to 22. So we're on 8. It's like annihilating an entire people, an entire population dispersed throughout so many nations. It's never going to happen. It's the middle of the 20th century. So it's just absolute outright denial. They could still get out at this point. What is Eliezer's father's response? I'm too old to start over. I'm sure he regrets that. We're not worried. But then the Germans penetrate Hungarian territory, and this is where people begin to actually worry. They're like, it's getting closer, right? Theme of indifference. It's starting to touch me. Now it matters. Now I can't ignore it. So that's what we come down to. Denial is hard to keep intact if something is right in front of your face, especially when it impacts you directly. So we have the progression of the Jewish feelings, and then the next thing, and there's just this reinforcement all the way through. And this is on page 9. Let me see if I can find it here. Let's see, I cannot find it here. Let me find it. The news spread. Okay, so before that, I can't find. Sorry, if this were a one-to-one correspondence, this would be so much easier. The news spread, and this says, our first impression, here it is, our first impression of the Germans were rather reassuring. So just this idea of wanting to make everything better. So this begins the progression of the Jewish subjugation. At this point, even in the middle of war, even though the Germans are there in their town, look at their response. Almost every rabbi's home became a house of prayer. We drank we ate, we sang. The Bible commands us to rejoice during the 8th day of celebration, but their hearts weren't in it. So it's starting to turn. And this is where the curtain finally rose. So this image of what's going on. The Germans arrested the leaders. From that on, everything happened quickly. The race toward death had begun. So here's where we really see the turning point. And this, the race toward death has become, is on page 10. So here, page 10 begins the progression of what happens to the Jews. And the progression is, number one, they can't leave their residence. Number two, they can't own valuables. In fact, they have to give them to the Germans. Then very quickly, the yellow star, which is obviously symbolic for the Holocaust and the extermination of the Jews. Then they're moved into ghettos. And excuse me, this the ghettos is where it ends up until over on page 13, and we'll get there, the transports, and then ultimately deportation. And that's what the next chapter, chapter 2, deals with. Sorry, taking a drink. So over the next few pages, page 10 into page 11, we see that progression. And even during that time, at this point, it's just still kind of just denial and disbelief. We're still at that very part. I mean, there does come alarm when that alarm part is when when everything starts getting stripped from them. But it's still this idea of trying to make the best of it. So let's look at the ghettos represent, of course, you can see them as symbols, the separation of the Jews from the rest of the people. And that's a really important symbol because that is indicative of and representative of how the Germans, obviously Hitler, treated the Jews. They were outsiders. They were different. They weren't allowed to and shouldn't intermingle with the other, more authentic, pure people. So that's seen in the ghettos is the easiest way to kind of get them to to get them out of the way. So this first ghetto, the response to the ghetto was that people thought it was a good thing. I'm on page 12. Let me see. Yeah. The barbed wire that encircled us like a wall did not fill us with real fear. In fact, we felt this was not a bad thing. We were entirely among ourselves, a small Jewish republic. They thought it was a good thing. No more fear, no more anguish. We could live among the Jews, among brothers. So they honestly felt safe being separated. They felt like they had kind of got some more autonomy. They felt like being separated gave them, and that wall, that's a symbol, that wall of being separated, instead of seeing it for what it was, imprisoning them, they felt like they were actually placed into a sanctuary. Wiesel works a lot in contrasts, and I'm going to get to that in a moment because there's one passage at the end of this chapter that I'm literally going to do a close analysis of, a critical analysis of, a close read, basically line by line. But this contrast of what the wall represents to the Germans and the Jews. For the Germans, obviously, it's an imprisonment. For the Jews, it's a safety. So those kinds of things you can look at. Patterns. What each character thinks about what's going on. So if I were going to write a paper for this particular chapter, I've already talked about the Jewish response, what was going on, but you can look at contrasts as well. There's a lot of that in here. So on page 12, obviously this book is called Night. Night is the most important symbol in the entire book. And the thing is, night means different things in different places to different people throughout the book. That's an important thing to remember. Probably the best paper to write, and it might even be what you write your final project on. The concept is what the symbol of night actually means. Now, I can't remember if this is the very first time we see night. On page 12, night fell. But night fell, you could write pages on what that means. And again, a lot of what I'm talking about assumes an understanding of the rest of the novel. But at this point, you already know what night means. For most people, night is rest. It's peaceful time. It's a time to recharge. It's a good thing. But night in this book obviously can represent evil. It can represent moral depravity. Um, and that would be on the German side. For the Jews, it obviously means absolute despair and no hope. So night fell. So ask yourself, I'm sorry, I'm not on the right page up here. Night fell, this again on page 12 in your book. What does night fell mean here? Is it the beginning of no hope for the Jews? Is it the beginning of the atrocities that are going to be committed against the Jews? It's a symbol. It's your interpretation. It can be any of that or all of that. So we do see now the progression of disbelief and just absolute, why is this happening? So we go through, we did a forum on the ghetto was ruled neither by German nor Jew, it was ruled by delusion. That kind of plays into what that symbol of the wall that I just went over, but it's also means that in that moment, none of the characters matters. It places the emphasis on the reaction of the Jews. It's sometimes our reality is what we tell ourselves it is, and that's what the Jews were doing. But we know, especially with the perspective that we have as readers, knowing what's coming, we know that the delusion is a safety measure, but also ultimately what leads to their demise, at least initially, because of thinking that it's not going to be that bad. Their delusions landed them in the ghetto. That's simplistic and not at all fair, because the majority of them would have ended up there anyway, but it is in part, for one, it didn't save Elie's family, right? They had a couple of times they could get out. So they're talking about the transports. Ellie's father was involved in knowing all of that because he is an important person in the Jewish community. And so now we see this progression of getting them ready to be transported. And here is where we see the first episode of Unprovoked Violence coming up on page 16, but just the systematic degradation and subjugation and pulling from them everything they know, specifically the concept of home. We see a lot of imagery, home imagery, coming up. In fact, looking ahead, as they're leaving and they look back on the homes, Elie calls it an open tomb, and we'll get there. But this concept of home is extraordinarily important for Jews. It's important for all of us, but home is kind of can be equated here with their faith and their religion, because they're so inexorably tied to each other, and it makes it really, really important. And so there's still a lot of talk about how the Jews are feeling in this moment. They're lied to. Obviously, they're told they can bring some things, but another foreshadowing is they try to bring things with them. Obviously, by the time they get on the transport, they have nothing. Some of them had some stuff, hidden on their person, but ultimately, every time they tried to bring something with them, they had to drop it, and they just continued to be stripped of everything they own. And you can even push it as far as, that could be representative of their faith. Just over time, they just lose everything. And that can be something that that is symbolic too of what's happening to them. On page 15, I'll have to find this in here. Page 15, in your textbook, in your book, to the last moment, people clung to hope. So this is where we finally see the veil of indifference or denial coming off them, because it's happening to them. They can no longer at all keep anything. So here we see another one of Wiesel's contrasts, but the first thing that obviously the Jews shed are valuables, and then they just try to keep things that would help them survive. And even they lose that, the water and the bread and things like that. But look at this contrast of all of this beautiful stuff under a magnificent blue sky. Um, Pitiful relics that seem never to have had a home. This abandonment, and it's under this magnificent blue sky that's supposed to be beautiful and lovely and representative of, hope and everything good. And that contrast right there, especially if you think about it in terms of the night symbol, night fell, and Wiesel keeps saying, talks about a blue sky, and here in a moment he talks about the sun, and there's a contrast there too. And Wiesel does this a lot. And I know in one of my last videos I talked about how he, in the section or in the chapter where he talks about the hangings, and Elie talked about what the soup tasted like prior, or after the first hanging, and as they went on, he talked about what the soup then represented him, and that's a symbol too of his changing attitude towards what he was experiencing, initially being happy that he survived, and then the recognition of the soup that tasted like the soup that tasted the best it's ever tasted because he was still alive, and then the soup that tasted like corpses, understanding that he's only alive on the backs of other people who have died. That's why he has that ration of soup. Wiesel does that a lot in the books, the contrasts. So we have that contrast, and then Elie's family is one of the only who one of the last to leave. Here's the first example through the Hungarian police of just unprovoked violence. Use their rifle butts, their clubs to indiscriminately strike old men, women, children, and cripples. And that is an example of Elie's understatement. He just throws it away. He just puts it there. There's no reaction to the absolute horror of that. It's not described in great detail. It's presented as a fact. And it being just presented as a fact really informs the coming story, how they just had to become desensitized to the absolute horror that they were experiencing. So on page 16, I'm still on page 16. This is a really, really hard, passage. There was joy. They're leaving. There was joy. Yes, joy. There's joy that they're leaving, that they're heading to the transport. Such irony. It's dramatic irony here. People must have thought there could be no greater torment in God's hell than that of being stranded here on the sidewalk among the bundles in the middle of the street under a blazing sun. Anything seemed preferable to that. That is a use of irony. And I said dramatic irony because we know what's coming. The people, the Jews here at this point in the story, do not. And that's where it gets really, really serious. This is an excellent example of the way that Wiesel uses irony through the characterization of the people. So you can imagine that it would feel like joy to escape a current situation. The foreshadow, of course, through the irony is that we know that they're going someplace much, much worse. So that's definitely a literary device. Here we come to this idea and this image of the chief rabbi, who is like, in Christian terms, holy, like the Pope for the Catholic faith. So he's in this procession. He's without his beard, a bundle on his back. His very presence in the procession was enough to make the scene seem surreal, because what we actually have here, the rabbi has become a symbol of the fall of faith. It cannot escape the situation. The faith is just intimately tied into what's going on. And Elie's sitting there looking at it like, oh my goodness, even our faith isn't saved or can't be separate from what's going on with us. So that's a really important part there. And that is on page 17. So now we're getting into, right down here, this is great imagery. So we have beaten dogs, obviously an image, already setting up the animal imagery, and that speaks to the dehumanization theme. He sets this up here in chapter 1. So we follow this along, and so we have this image of them that basically shows them they're perceived as animals. Here's another image. The street resembled fairgrounds deserted in haste. And here's another place where Wiesel uses contrast. So this concept of fairgrounds, but right next to everything that was left behind. So fairgrounds, what's left behind? The trash, right? The destruction isn't anything people would want. Here, banknotes, faded portraits, their history, their livelihood is what's left behind. So this concept of it looking like fairgrounds sets up the contrast that really shows the poignancy of what the Jews have lost at this point. And obviously fairgrounds supposed to be, fair is something that's supposed to be fun. A joyous occasion, obviously that is not what the Jews are experiencing. Then here's the other imagery, open rooms everywhere. Gaping doors and windows looked out into the void. It all belonged to everyone since it no longer belonged to anyone. It was there for the taking, an open tomb. Death imagery, obviously foreshadowing of what's coming. And a summer sun. Again with the contrast, this is horrible compared to a summer sun. Summer sun conveys, beauty, warmth. Summer is something beautiful for most people, so the contrast is just particularly challenging, right? I'm on page 17. Now I'm moving on to page 18, and here we have another night. Let me see if I can find it. Night has fallen. I guess I did not. Night had fallen here. I have it highlighted in my book. I don't have it highlighted here. So night had fallen. That evening we went to bed early. So night here could just be traditional night. But again, we've already talked about what night symbolizes, so I won't go into that point. Here we have my father was crying. This is a progression of the father. That's hard. This feeds into the father-son relationship, the family relationship theme, because up until now, Elie had always seen his father as basically the pinnacle of the Jewish faith and someone strong, and to see his father break down was particularly hard for Elie. Here they are staining to, I want to look at this image, the same hellish sun. Hellish sun is actually an oxymoron. So because hell is dark, sun is light. Hell is death, sun is life. So again, with the contrast, right? That would be a really good paper to write about this book. You could find everything you need in chapter 1. So this oxymoron, that means putting two words side by side that mean complete opposites for literary effect. And that is what Wiesel has done here. So it really gives you a lot of meaning without having to say much. And we have hellish sun versus summer sun. So an important contrast there. So I am moving closer to the point of the close analysis there at the end. This says people's morale was not so bad. We were beginning to get used to the situation. Kind of a foreshadowing, but also kind of something sad, because this idea of the Jews are just going to have to assimilate and get used to, acclimate, because it's the only way to survive. And the survival theme, of course, a really important one, and we'll get to that in the next chapters. So this acclimation, doing whatever you have to do to survive, we see it here. Again, I told you chapter 1 sets up everything of the book. And here, again, this naturally we refuse to be separated. Father said, I'll stay here if you want to go with Maria. Elie was like, nope. So family, really important, that family thing. All right, so here is where, I don't know why that part isn't. So this is all one, yeah, here. Sorry, I'm going to do it all at once because that's what I like. There we go. So here's where I'm going to do a close analysis. Night, we already know that is a symbol. Here it's kind of a foreshadowing of what's to come. So if you want to talk about symbols as foreshadowing, that is important. So no one was praying for the night to pass quickly. Loss of hope It can also represent, obviously, no one wants it to leave. The stars were but sparks of the immense conflagration that was consuming us. Were this conflagration, it could be conflagration, it's conflagration, sorry, to be extinguished one day. It's just a word I know and have seen a lot, but I don't know that I've ever spoken it out loud, just to be honest. Were this conflagration to be extinguished one day, nothing would be left in the sky but extinct stars and unseen eyes. If you break this down, this is foreshadowing. It's the Holocaust in a nutshell, and it's also very metaphoric and imagistic. So what you can see is, let me bring it here. Sparks of conflagration, that's just fire consuming us. Obviously, that's going to be the sad fate of most of them. Were this conflagration to be extinguished one day, so even though the fires have stopped, nothing would be left in the sky. So there's the symbol of the stars as the Jews themselves, the metaphor, but extinct stars and unseeing eyes. So the Jews being extinct, we know some of them survived. That's actually called the diaspora, and that's a word meaning the Jews who were scattered to other countries. So their belief is that in the end times, before the return of their Messiah, they all come back together in Jerusalem. So the diaspora is foreshadowing, because we know that that happens. But this, if you really look at it closely, also shows, this is kind of Elie talking about the Holocaust as a whole, because nothing would be left in the sky, and the unseen eyes, obviously the ones who ignored the entire situation. So there's a lot of imagery. Also shows how he's not going to forget the theme of trauma. So all of this metaphor, comparisons, extinct stars equal the Jews, the unseen eyes, the indifference, just this portrait of foreshadowing of the Holocaust, what it's going to mean, what its effect is going to be, and the importance of that. And this is on page 21. Sorry if I didn't say that. All right, we're at the end, folks. Let's look at some final things. On page 21, they are, continuing on page 21, they are expelled on Saturday, the day of rest. So again, the Sabbath day for them was holy, and you weren't supposed to do any work. So this contrast of being, expelled, this extreme work on their holy day, is pretty telling as well. On page, this is on page, let me double check my notes, 22, where they're talking about all this imagery of the synagogue. Resembled, so the destruction of the synagogue, it resembled a large railroad station. So a railroad station takes you to different places. So they're moving away from their faith into the Holocaust that they're trying to endure. Just going to check the recording one more time because it makes me nervous. The altar was shattered, the wall covering shredded, the walls themselves bare. There were so many of us we could hardly breathe. Now, this imagery right here, or description, altar was shadowed, the wall covering shredded, the walls themselves bare. This is significant for the theme of faith. One of the most important considerations in the Jewish faith is the destruction of the temple. The temple, which was the seat of Judaism in ancient times, it was destroyed twice. And that is something that the Jews care very much about, because obviously it was the beginning of their persecution, the destruction of their faith. Now, I actually looked it up. I knew that it was important, and that this was an allusion to the destruction of the temple. So the synagogue is acting as a symbol of the temple, which again, illustrating their faith. But also here, we already see the idea of the faith crumbling due to what is perpetrated against them. But here it says the temple was not only the center of the practice of ancient Judaism in Israel, but also held huge symbolic importance within Judaism as the sign of God's proximity. And that's why I pulled up this. I read it in many different places, but this idea of God's proximity, because in later chapters, that's what Elie is saying. Where are you, God? Why aren't you here? Why aren't you intervening? So this is already setting that up. And so with the temple being destroyed, the second one, the Jews felt cut off from God. They didn't know how the destruction could happen within the Jewish understanding of God's powerful influence over the events of the world. So that right there, my friends, is the foundation of the loss of faith theme, and it's right here for you. Finally, at the end, so that's probably the most important thing about at the end here. This is just the literary device of understatement. Forbidden to go outside, people relieve themselves in a corner. Two things, understatement, I mean, the absolute horror of that in front of everyone. And Wiesel just like, there it is, it's a fact. He does that a lot. His understatement, he uses them as fact, and a lot of times it's something absolutely horrible, but he just says it because it is just fact, just something they have to accept as part of their existence now. But it's also a further desecration of the temple, the synagogue as the symbol of the temple. Now, our last little point here, they were all smiles, all things considered. It had gone very smoothly. Those are the Gestapo officers. Think about that. Think about the level of indifference. Think about the level of participation. All things considered, it had gone smoothly. Again, another understatement. Absolute picture of just the moral depravity and the cruelty of the people who did this. It's just absolutely horrific. It's mind-boggling. So, like I said, when I do a close analysis, I look for patterns and connections. So in this chapter, we had Moshe's character, we had the progression of the Jewish subjugation, the townspeople or the Jews' reaction, and the multiple meaning of night. We had a lot about contrasts. We had a lot about understatement. We had the illusion, the destruction of the temple, that's key. And we pretty much have all the main themes. Loss of faith, we have family, we have indifference, we have the concept of what's going to have to happen for survival. So we have all of those things going on. I think there was another one, it's not immediately coming to mind, but I'm sure I alluded to all of them. So a really important chapter, and that's how you would do a close reading. I would just work through it, and again, it's kind of unfair because I have the literary devices in my head, easily accessible. I would suggest you could just have a worksheet or a printout of the literary devices as you're looking through the chapter to look for these things. But I think this is going to be helpful to you because I've shown you the literary devices that he's going to continually be using: imagery, symbolism, contrast, rhetorical questions. Those are the main ones. Those are the ones that are really important. But you can also look at characterization, how the characters react. You can look at plot. Plot, obviously very important, how it informs what's going on and the character's reaction against that. And the characterization, that the Jews' reaction to their circumstances, which is plot, is important. Once we get into the camp's tone, is going to become important. Atmosphere, the setting, all of those things are going to come into play as well. But for now, those are the most important ones to look at. So I hope you enjoyed kind of this close reading of Night. And again, some of the other videos will be shorter because they aren't as long, but one is an incredible introduction to what we can expect in this really hard to read but ultimately transforming socially significant book.